I'm joined by my guest, Einar Tangen, in Beijing. He's a senior fellow at the Taipei Institute, as well as chairman of Asia Narratives. In Paris, we have Jacques Sapir. He is professor emeritus at the School for Advanced Studies at Social Sciences. And in New Mexico, we have Ken Hammond. He is a professor of East Asian and Global History at New Mexico State University. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. I want to talk about the European proposal here, and I want to talk about the Chinese one. For the European one, Jacques, I'm going to go to you first in Paris. So we have the UK, France, and Germany talking to Ukraine about a possible settlement. Essentially, it boils down to get as much land as you possibly can by summer or early fall, and we'll fill you up as much arms as you can carry. I don't understand how that is any kind of proposal at all, but that's what the media is telling us here. It doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't bring peace to Europe, but that's what we're told they're pushing. Does it make any sense to you? Go ahead in Paris.
Well, actually not. Actually not. Well, we know that the French government, of course, had always said that only negotiations could end this war. But he also said that negotiation had to be decided by the Ukrainian side. And so far, we are seeing absolutely no sign from Kyiv that the Ukrainians want to go to a negotiation, or at least if they want to go to a negotiation, it's only on the basis of a complete withdrawal of Russian forces. This is not, of course, a solution. Now, what we could say is that it's mounting a growing fatigue of the war in Europe, and mostly in Paris, maybe London, certainly in Berlin, and also the acknowledgement that the military forces of European NATO members are now more or less exhausted. We had several speeches made by high-ranking military officers, both in Berlin and in London, saying that their own armies are now completely depleted of any shell reserves. And this is probably the same situation in Paris. So I think that there is also a belated acknowledgement that it's time now to, just because European members of NATO will not sustain Ukraine anymore.
Well, okay, but Ken, if I can go to you in New Mexico here, what happened to as long as it takes, whatever it takes, all the rhetoric coming out of the Biden administration? Because the facts on the ground belie the kind of victory rhetoric that has been going on for over a year now. I mean, and on top of it, Ken, the European proposal doesn't really involve talking to Russia. So this can't be a negotiation if one of the main parties is not part of the negotiations, as it were. Go ahead, Ken.
Sure. I think that there's two things that we're touching on here. One is, of course, that President Biden's recent visit to Kyiv and then his sort of pep rally in Poland. These, I think, are not signs of, the anything forever attitude, but these are sort of desperate attempts to try to shore up the situation, to try to manipulate the European allies into continuing to maintain the support which is directed not at an actual resolution of the conflict, but which is directed at kind of a perpetual war, the goal of which is to try to bleed Russia, to damage Russia, to inflict as much harm as they can, rather than, caring about the interests of either the Russian or the Ukrainian people. As for the proposals that we're looking at today, I agree with Jacques that there are these rumors or these stories that are circulating about possible initiatives coming out of France or Germany or even Britain. aren't really about serious efforts to resolve the conflict. They're still talking about kind of open-ended military support for one side, and as you've noted, not really talking about sitting down with people and talking back and forth across the table. And that's a strong contrast to the Chinese proposal.
Yeah.
The Chinese proposal, which has just been issued, is really in many ways a reiteration of what have always been basic principles of Chinese foreign policy, and which are also articulated in their global security initiative. They want respect for sovereignty. They want respect for territorial integrity. They want, to have things resolved by negotiation and dialogue. I think some of the critical things are that the Chinese are calling for ending the sanctions, ending unilateral sanctions. They're calling for abandoning the Cold War mentality, which is really what has brought us to this situation, the relentless expansion of NATO.
Well, since the Chinese proposal has been mentioned, let's go to Beijing. Einar, let me read just a small fragment of the 12-point program that China recently released. Countries should prevent bloc confrontation, which I think is talking about NATO here, and work towards building a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security architecture. I don't know what it sounds like in Mandarin, but I know what that sounds like in Russian. So this is what the Russians have been talking about even before the conflict started. Go ahead in Beijing.
Well, I agree with my colleagues. The conflict has ground to a halt. I mean, at this juncture, it could go on for years, the way it's been perpetuated. And quite frankly, Great Britain, France, and Germany are being hurt by this, and they are being drained. The amount of actual money that's flowing into Ukraine is actually now greater on a monthly basis than which was flowing into Afghanistan. So, I mean, right now, I see this move as just trying to prod Zelensky, kind of remind him that this can't go on forever. I mean, this is a country that has lost 35% of its GDP in the last year. It is now pre-2019, it had a per capita GDP of about less than 5,000. Now it's about 1,250. That's a year, $1,250 a year GDP. So, they're in dire straits. Ukraine can't keep this up forever. There might be a desire on the U.S. side to grind Russia down and in the same breath take out a active competitor, that is Europe. But at some point, Europe is going to say, no, we're not willing to do that. We're not going to have a mutual drowning pact with Russia and see ourselves, in essence, decimated already. Germany is facing tremendous pressure. They're laying off people left, right, and center. Their industries are fleeing to other places, the car companies, for instance, to China, making deals with their joint venture partners so that they can produce in China so that they'll be competitive worldwide, because they can't do so if they stay in Germany. So at this point, there is, tremendous weariness. There's, a lot of bellicose jingoism. Everyone's trying to convince everyone else that they're tough and ready to stand strong. Hopefully that's a precursor to actually sitting down at the table. But Zelensky is in a difficult political situation after saying he won't give an inch.
Yeah.
How do you backtrack on that? And would he be reelected or thrown out?
It's been, the word existential has been thrown around a lot, but, whatever happens in Ukraine, it will be existential for Mr. Zelensky, but he volunteered for the job, okay? That's his choice. Jacques, we had Treasury Secretary Yellen visit Ukraine with a $10 billion package, basically to keep the lights on here. I mean, if there's so much dependency there, why doesn't the Americans, it's up to them. I mean, Kiev is 100% reliant, or I should say Zelensky is 100% reliant on the United States right now and the European Union. It's up, the European Union and particularly Washington can call this off today, now. Go ahead in Paris.
Well, actually, I think that Zelensky is, of course, relying much on United States for military procurements, and not so on Europe. Europe is seen much more as a mid to long-term opportunity for Ukraine. Now, the problem is that the war in Ukraine has been draining out all the military stocks, all the stockpiles accumulated for years and for years. I recently read a paper saying that 10 years of stockpile have been dissipated in just 6 months in Ukraine. So far, the situation is more and more driven by this problem. You know, United States or Europe could make some promise like, you know, $10 billion or 15 billion euros, okay. But the problem is what will be delivered in the next week, in the next months. And that's the real problem now for Ukraine. You know, it's very good to say, well, we are to contribute for the reconstruction, for the rebuilding of Ukraine to such and such level. Okay. But now the problem is Ukraine is fighting. The war is expanding a huge quantity of ammunition. You know, it's more or less.
Well, you know, Jacques, we're almost out of time for this part of the program. I don't understand why anybody's talking about reconstruction. We don't even know what Ukraine is going to be for reconstruction to begin. It's farcical. They keep wanting to spend money without any kind of strategic goals. It really it belies reality here. Gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on peace proposals. Okay, let's go back to Ken. Ken, again, with the European proposal, we haven't seen it on paper, okay? This is just leaks from the media. You know, what the French, the Germans, and the British are talking about, again, it doesn't solve any problems. It's actually just saying, hey, let's just take a break so we can rebuild up Ukraine with a lot more NATO weapons, and then we'll just continue the conflict. I mean, that's one interpretation of this. I don't know why they think that would work. Your thoughts? Go ahead.
Well, that seems, I couldn't agree more. I think that these, you know, and as you say, there's nothing on paper. No government has issued an official kind of statement or anything. These are rumors. These are sort of, you know, trial balloons that are getting floated, although probably balloons aren't the best thing to talk about right now. But, you know, I think that, you know, the problem is that this is a situation that has gotten bogged down for NATO and for the Americans. They're making rather desperate moves, either to try to you know pump up the attitude again to you know have Biden go and show up in Kyiv, or to maybe suggest that, oh, maybe we are ready to think about some kind of negotiation. But everybody from Zelensky on west is saying, but we won't negotiate with Putin. We won't negotiate with the Russians. Well, who are you going to negotiate with if you're not going to negotiate with President Putin? And he's the leader of the Russian Federation right now, and that's the way it is. It's just a situation that has become unmanageable, certainly from the side of the West. And the irony, I think, is that what may well emerge from all of this in the end, when finally people do sit down and talk, is a resolution that's going to look very much like what Russia proposed to begin with.
I agree with.
In terms of the position of territories and populations.
No, I absolutely. Everybody just go back to December 17, 2021, and the proposal is there. It was sent to NATO. It was sent to Washington. And Ken, you're right. I think we're going to basically get that, okay? And what a pity it is for Ukraine to have to go through that and all the suffering that's gone, like in Europe, for example, as a result. Einar, let me go back to you in Beijing here. So we're talking about negotiations here, but I have a problem with that as well, because we had the Minsk process. We had Angela Merkel, we had President Hollande, and they've come out in the last couple of months saying that they weren't dealing in good faith. So if anyone from the West, an intermediary and all that, the Russians are going to say, well, who do we trust here? We had two interlocutors for years, for 7 years, lied and deceived. I mean, so that is the West has created an enormous reputational problem for itself. I mean, it doesn't take things. It says things. It writes things. It signs things, but it's not worth anything. And that's another problem the West has in trying to end a conflict that it started. Go ahead in Beijing.
Well, that is the irony. You have many of these powers insisting that they're upholding the international order and the rule of law, when in fact they're doing exactly the opposite. And I'd have to agree. I mean, the U.S. cannot claim to be anything but a rogue nation. It's walked away from treaties in Iran on climate change twice, and several others.
Arms control. And very important arms control agreements the U.S. has walked from. I'm sorry to interrupt, but keep going.
Yeah, but Peter, you're right. I mean, there is no trust, and that is the basis. You cannot have an international order unless you have agreements and trust. And at this juncture, by exposing the fact that they were not dealing in good faith during Maiden 1 and 2, they basically destroyed that. So the only way you can do that is if there are powers sitting at the table who are going to offer guarantees, and I don't mean just China. There'd have to be others out there, India, et cetera, the world coming together, and whether Washington wants peace or not, saying, look, we'll guarantee this. I think that would give a way out, at least for most of the Europeans. They feel very strongly. I talked to a lot of the ambassadors here in Beijing, and they're, they say, well, what Russia did is unconscionable, and you have to side with us. And I said, well, what are you doing to help China with its problems? I mean, you seem to only want help when you want it. You don't want to give any help. Where's the trust on your side? The trust goes both ways, and they don't want to talk about it. They just want to say, well, this is our problem. You've got to do something about it. I don't understand why that affects China, but that's the attitude there. So no trust, no going forward.
Well, it's very interesting, gentlemen, is that when something's important to Washington, they want people to listen and act. But when other countries have issues, the U.S. and its Western allies just brush it off. I go back to this statement of December 17, 2021, when the Russians said, here's our proposal for European security. And it was completely brushed away because Washington isn't interested in that. Jacques, let me go to you in Paris. On the issue of trust here, who blew up the Nord Stream pipelines? Do you want to trust those people in negotiations?
Well, certainly, the Nord Stream pipeline will be one topic, or more precisely, one bargaining chip in any negotiation. But as said before, the problem is trust. There is, of course, no trust or very, very low level of trust from Russia toward European, mostly Germany and France. And there is very, very little trust in Europe toward Russia. So this is the first problem. Now, what is also appearing is mistrust between NATO. Now you are hearing in France more and more people saying, well, the United States are acting without taking advice from other countries. They are playing their own game, and to some extent, they have also damaged Europe, and most precisely Germany. So we have, of course, mistrust between Russia and NATO. And from the Russian side is perfectly understandable because of the declaration of Mrs. Merkel and Mr. François Hollande. But there is also now a growing feeling of mistrust inside NATO. And this is making any negotiation extremely
well,
difficult.
Jacques, I mean, it's during this entire process here, obviously Washington doesn't care what the Europeans think about anything. I'm sorry, but that's the truth, okay? Listen to Victoria Nuland, she has scant regard for her so-called allies in Europe. Ken, let me go to you. One way we got here is that the whole post-war security arrangement in Europe was designed without Russia and against Russia. A peace in Ukraine has to allow Russia to be part of that process. Do you think the West can do that and make such a dramatic change and say, hey, you're part of the process here, okay? I can't see any virtually no politician in the West being able to say that. And that's really the problem that we face. Go ahead, Ken.
Well, that is absolutely a major problem, and you know, I think that Joe Biden is in some ways he's kind of the last old Cold Warrior, you know, and now he's right at the forefront of what is becoming the new Cold War, and he just doesn't seem to think that anything has changed since 1962. You know, and I think that that's a very dangerous mentality. It's hard to imagine the United States making an honest and sincere effort to resolve this conflict, because the United States sought out and generated this conflict. You know, the progressive movement of NATO East, the step-by-step expansion, the approach to Russia's borders, something which, you know, was promised not to happen and then did happen. Yet again, an example of not keeping one's word on the part of the Americans. This is what brought us to the situation in which we find ourselves today. And there's no indication whatsoever that America's political elites are prepared to think about the world in a way other than, you know, it's our way or the highway. And that's obviously not working.
You know, Einar, in Beijing, in your personal opinion, what do you think the Chinese leadership has learned about international affairs and dealing with the West, particularly Washington, during this last 12 months?
Well, I mean, it's nothing new. I mean, it's American exceptionalism, this idea that the U.S. has to be in control of the world in order to prevent World War III. Unfortunately, that thinking is probably going to lead to it. China is extremely concerned. It's not, you know, they really do fear that there could be a nuclear war if Russia is pushed. More arms go into this. Eventually, it spreads a contagion. And at that juncture, you know, all bets are off. And quite frankly, they're concerned about whether the U.S. is going to use this as an excuse to cause trouble and more trouble in Taiwan. Right. So they see a lot of parallels, a mirror of, you know, using proxy countries as tools to weaken what they perceive as a competitor. So at this juncture, the U.S. Is not an entity to be trusted. China knows that, but they're looking outside of that area. They're looking to Europe, which has, you know, visceral interests involved in this. They're looking to the rest of the world, including the global South, to say, listen, if we don't act together, we're going to literally be killed alone. So at this juncture, China is looking for the alternate way of bringing trust to the table. You're not going to get it between Europe and Russia and the United States. So there has to be another way of doing it, bringing more countries into this kind of pressure point to bring the sides together and do it. But I do think it goes back to Minsk I, that at that juncture, you know, you can have a united Ukraine, but it's a loose federation of states, which would take a supermajority to allow any kind of you know, NATO or the EU to come in. Plus, there would have to be an agreement to make sure that Russia's security interests are observed as. You know, she said, you know, one country's security cannot rest on the insecurity of others.
That's what it's called, the indivisibility of security. That's all the time we have, gentlemen. I want to thank my guests in Beijing, Paris, and in New Mexico.